Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether the Tolkien's languages are pronounced Kenya or Quenya. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is saying, no, High Elvish is pronounced Kenya, not Quenya. And that's me, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great stories in our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. All right, so let me open the podcast with a very basic point. Setting. You literally cannot have a story without a setting. Whether it's Tudor England, modern-day New York, or some planet on the other side of the galaxy, a story needs to take place somewhere. Even if that somewhere is the vacuum of space or Janet's Void from The Good Place. And for many stories, a simple setting is fine. People can, and have, written plays that take place completely within a single apartment or a bench in the park. But some stories decide to ratchet things up a bit. They add details to the setting. Maybe it starts off with the geography. Then it's the people who live in that geography. Then it's the people's rulers. And then the rulers' neighbors. And then the neighbors' rulers. And then those rulers might go to war, so you need a code of ethics for the warriors, and then, well, you get the idea. You all see where I'm going with this, and this whole process is called world building. Some folks, like me, super love it. Others tolerate it. But whether you're in the middle of writing an epic sci-fi trilogy or binging an epic fantasy on Netflix, world building is an essential part of story and one that you'll have to contend with sooner or later. So what exactly do we mean by world building? What can it add to a story? What happens when it's not done well? What happens when it is done well? Well, to answer these questions and more, we did not need to look any further than Anselm's own Arts Guild. You see, author Elisa Lambert is a world-building guru, and she's joining us here at the table. Welcome to the table.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you, and let me apologize. Well, sort of. We were supposed to record this all in person, and it would have been nice, and it would have been around a table, and we'd have, snacks and everything. The weather intervened, so we are all recording remotely in town, which, it happens. But thank you so much, and let me start off by saying that this all started because you gave a really cool talk to the Anselm Arts Guild about world building. So let's get a little bit of background for you. But first, to build our own world here at the table, we need to introduce the co-host here, Evangeline Denmark. Evangeline, how are you doing?
I am doing well, thank you. How are you this Wednesday? It's Ash Wednesday.
We are recording this on Ash Wednesday. That's true. It was a chilly Ash Wednesday, perfect for mortifying the flesh and reminding us all of our frailty. But Evangeline, before we start all the world building talk with our guest, how do you feel about world building with your stories? Are you super into it, or do you just kind of get enough to be dangerous?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd probably err on the dangerous side. I don't love it as much as other fantasy authors that I know. I do enjoy it, certain aspects of it I find really challenging. But yeah, it's not my favorite thing about writing.
Okay, well, me and Elisa are going to team up on you for this, and hopefully we'll force you to agree with us by the end. But Elisa, let's talk about your background. How did you first start? How did you first start building worlds?
I drew a map, kind of randomly. That's how I started, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention Tolkien as the inspiration for even that much. I was, of course, like many Anselmians. Do we have a word for our
Anselmians? Yes, we do now. It's that one.
We need one. I don't feel like that's the best one. I feel like we could workshop that a little bit. But like many of us.
Anselmites.
Yeah, Anselmites. I feel like that's better.
I don't think that's good.
Yeah, we'll work on it. Maybe by the end of the conversation, we'll have thought of a good one. But yeah, inspired by Tolkien, like loved him since I was a little kid. My dad read his stories to us. So yeah, I just started drawing a map one day, kind of, as you do when you're a child, you just make things. And it spawned this world that I've been working on since I was about 8 years old. There's been a lot of stories intertwined with that world, and it's grown up with me and evolved a lot with me. But along the way, I just wanted to learn more about who lived in that world and what their stories were. And so now it's a monster of a thing.
Awesome. I love how it started with one map when you were 8. It sort of makes me think of, let me just get this clear with everyone. If we are talking about world building, everyone's influenced by Tolkien, so let's just acknowledge it. We all are. Thank you, JRR. But the story for him is he started it off by he was like grading term papers and got really frustrated with it. So then he just sort of flipped one term paper over and wrote on the back, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and that's how it started. So it's interesting how these huge worlds can start with just like tiny things.
Yeah.
So let's go. When do you think you made the jump from being like, oh, you're a kid and you have this and it's super cool. I'm sure your parents thought you were adorable doing all this. But when did it go from there to, oh, I'm actually going to like research this and do a really good job?
Yeah, I don't know that I can think of a single point where it like became. I feel like even now, I feel like it's becoming, probably once quantum physics started entering into it, then it like kind of got to a whole new level. So that's just my quirkiness added to it, I guess. But I don't know. Yeah, like when something like that grows up with you, it's just constantly been revised. And even now, I still feel like I'm working on it, and I don't know that I'll ever be done truly. But I do think like in the last few years, there has developed more of a community around world building. So when I was younger, you could not go find books on it or podcasts or like D&D was probably the only real similar outlet and those kinds of stories. But now I feel like there are a lot of people that are talking about world building. You can go find world building friends. And so probably actually having some of those conversations with other people was one of the things that helped it grow into something a little bit more.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on this D&D bit really quick because of Evangeline. Among other things, you have a brother who is a D&D, what's the term I should use, master? Mage?
He is a game
wizard?
Yeah, a game master.
Well, there we go. Master. So you grew up with a lot of this sort of world building, didn't you? Did that influence anything about your writing, or maybe make you kind of maybe that's the reason why you feel the way you do?
I think I've said this before on the podcast, but you get asked the question, what do you wish that you'd known growing up about being a writer that would have helped you? And I always say I wish I would have played D&D in the basement with my brother, because that would have helped my world building. But I didn't. And I am, forever sorry, because when I get stuck, I have to call him. And, he gets me out of the fix or whatever it is because of his, game master skills. So when I came to world building, I had to get a book. I went through that, and I kept like reaching places where I'm like, oh, okay, I have to add this. And from what I've observed, it seems like people are either, the world comes first or the characters come first. I tend to be more characters come first, and then I have to build the world. So yeah, I feel like I'm always kind of trying to push out, get more, flesh out my world instead of that being the beginning of the story.
Let that be a lesson to everybody. When your brother is in the basement playing Dungeons and Dragons, maybe join him. You'll learn something.
Yes.
But
100%. Go play.
I know, Elisa, I really resonate with a lot what you were saying, because the world that I've been building, for quite some time. I started building it when I was, I think, 14. It's the same world that my first book is coming out on, so keep a look at it. Bandersnatch Press, February 2024, everybody. But the world has been growing a lot since then. I've made some big changes to it, but the essence has been there the whole time. And for me, going back to what Evangeline said, I very much started with the concept of a world, and then I kind of sort of thought of a story around it. Have you been doing that with your world too, where it's like, okay, my world's in place, now let's come up with some stories around it? What's the process been like for you?
I think they've really grown together for me in a lot of ways. Anytime I work on any piece of the world, I feel like it inspires a lot of stories. And there is a main story that I've worked on with this world. And so it will inspire things within that. But then also as I write, it then inspires me to go back and work on something, or usually it just unearths more questions that I need to go answer. But I think one thing about world building is that it can be highly involved, but it doesn't have to be. So I don't know if eventually that makes you feel better, but I think that there are a lot of people that enjoy the really deep dives into it. And I think oftentimes people who do play D&D tend to fall into that category because that's part of the fun for them, is like going into as much detail as they can. But I also think that you can do really effective world building, like with very broad brushstrokes as well. And I think some writers are very excellent at creating very vivid images and like making you feel like you understand this place that the story's a part of without necessarily giving you that many details. I actually think Lewis, there's many other authors, but I think that like if we're going to talk about Tolkien, we could talk about Lewis as the counterpart to that, where like, at least for me, when I think of his books, and I think back to being a kid, I have such vivid images of his stories and they have a real taste and flavor to them. But when you go back and read, like his descriptions are not very lengthy. He doesn't give you all that much detail, but he kind of brings your imagination into it. And I think the reader then kind of projects some of that world into his story. That was not what you asked. I got on a tangent there. But
no, I will hop on the tangent with you because I think it's a good one. And that is, I think there are a lot of temptations to go along with world building, right? And we'll get into those later. But one of them, I think, is not trusting the reader's imagination. Because, like, you know, there's like a really cool building in my story, and I'm tempted to like design it to the nth degree, right? But it's like, no, just throw in some language about how, you know, towers and spires or whatever, and the reader has an imagination. They can come up with it. They kind of prefer that. And you look at a lot of famous landmarks in fantasy literature, and oftentimes it's some broad strokes, and they become iconic because of the readers interacting with it. So now let's talk about the benefits or lack thereof of world building. I want to get to the how-tos in a bit, but before that, I just want to talk about like the goal of it. So if you're a storyteller, like let's say Elisa, a writer's coming up to you. They have this story, like maybe it's in a fantasy world, and they're like, world building, whatever. I don't know. What is your pitch to them? Like, why should they care about building a good world? How can having a good world help their story?
Yeah. So I would say the thing I think world building can do is, I'm going to sound counterproductive here. I actually think that world building is in some ways very frivolous. It's not necessary. You can tell a really good story without doing much world building at all. At the same time, though, I think it's important in the way that a lot of creative works are important, in that it's an act of creation, it's an act of imagination, and I think those two things are really important in their own right. In fact, I think world building can kind of challenge our idea that like creating is valuable for its own sake. I think that really like tests that theory, because I want to say that I believe that, you know, but if somebody asks for, you know, a defense for me to come up with like, why is world building good? I'm like tempted at first thought to say, oh, well, it doesn't actually really matter. It's not that important. But I think that creating without a utilitarian purpose behind it is a very valuable thing all in its own right. And I think that, I do think that, like, even though I say that I think it's a frivolous thing, I still think that world building can add value to a story. I think it can add richness and depth and flavor. But I also think, like, world building can really spark people's imaginations, and it can kind of create this dialogue with your readers and really invite them into a world. I mean, a lot of really effective world builders have basically, like, started these whole fandom universes that they probably never intended to, where, like, readers just get so excited about these stories that they just, like, want to write their own stories to contribute to it and do a deep dive. And even if they don't necessarily do that, I just think that certain worlds really can captivate our imaginations and draw us in deeper into a story and make us want to know more. And I think just like any imaginative thing, world building really sparks the imagination, and I think it can kind of light some fires. But I also think, just talking about the general value in being creative and in stoking the imagination, I think world building can kind of, you can say a lot just for its existence as a creative thing.
Yeah,
I was going to
agree. Thoughts on
agree.
that, Evangeline?
I was going to agree and add on to that in favor of world building. You can really discover conflict for your story as you dig into that world. Like you said, it sparks the imagination. It sparks story itself sometimes, especially for somebody who, like me, who tends to start with the character. You have to find ways that character is navigating this world, how they're at odds with the world that you're creating. And, it really can come in handy because you're like, oh, this certain thing, like this, way of government or whatever, my character is, totally at odds with. So what happens when they intersect with, the leaders or the, whoever it is? And that can be really useful. It can be really useful as well to know, once you get to a place in your story, okay, I know exactly how, this is going to work in this world, because you've already done that pre-work, that world building, like before you've gotten in. But, also the con is that sometimes you get stuck in world building forever because it's fun or it's interesting, or there's always something more. There's always like more that, I have to figure out like what their monetary system is. I have to figure out like when their planting season is. How do they eat? Like seriously, you could just do this forever and ever and never get started. So it's like, it's a great tool, but then also it can keep you from writing, just like any tools, any approaches that we take to writing. We can either use it or procrastinate with it. 100% guilty. So.
Yep, can confirm. I remember a couple years ago when I started, taking seriously the thought of like, okay, I've been sort of fiddling around with this for a while. Why don't I actually like write a novel? And I kept telling myself that I wasn't ready because like, no, I need to read a few like tomes on classical everyday life for like world building and stuff. And then it just sort of spins out of control. Elisa, have you ever been in that boat? And can you speak to those the risks of excessive world building?
Yes, for sure. I have definitely. I think I'm on that boat right now. I hate to admit it. I definitely have been
Safe
writing.
Space. It's okay.
But it's so easy to get distracted by the shiny things. And sometimes it's like, I really want to design this castle down to like, the silverware. And that's maybe a little bit excessive. So, yeah, but I totally agree with everything that you guys have said. I think, yeah, it can definitely add a sense of reality to the story. And I think some very interesting worlds drive the story, because there's something intriguing about that world that's actually driving the plot. And so, yes, I definitely am an advocate for it for sure. But I also think you guys are totally right. It's the swamp as well.
Yeah. World building is good, but artists out there, world build responsibly. It seems like if I can kind of synthesize the points that you both have been making, and I totally agree with them, about the benefits to a story of having good world building. One is it helps spark a lot of ideas. Like in the process of building the worlds, you come up with ideas for stories. And I can attest to this too, again, with the stuff I do. Like there are big plot points or story ideas where it's like, oh, here's this city that I came up with, and then blah, 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 blah. And then the whole story just sort of comes because you started with the world and then it sort of generated. 2 is the invitation to the reader. It's sort of this invitation to a deeper world. So it's almost like an iceberg method, right? Where I think, to me, and I'm guessing a lot of people who enjoy stories, one of the things I love the most is when the artist hints at a broader world out there, right? You can, again, everything comes back to Tolkien. I remember, he'll have, throwaway lines in the text where it's alluding to this huge prior kingdom or race of people, and it's just sort of hinted at, and then they move on. It's like, oh, there's a whole universe through that other door right there, and that's just so intriguing. It invites the reader in. And finally, the third point here is it's just intrinsically a good thing to create all this stuff. An example I found, I didn't mean for this to be another Tolkien example, but it is. Because I was so popular in high school, I watched the Making of Lord of the Rings DVDs extras extensively. And as part of that, they were talking about, the extra details the costume designers would put into their, the armor and all the other stuff. And there's this one scene where King Theoden is getting fitted for his armor. I know you other Tolkien nerds out there know exactly what scene I'm talking about. And inside the armor, whoever made it engraved this really elaborate, Rohan-style horse. And it never appeared on film. Whoever did it would have known that it was never going to appear on the film. The only person who saw it probably was the person who made it and the actor playing King Theoden. But King Theoden, he talks about how meaningful that was to him and how that got him in character. So, did it help make the actor a more efficient actor? Who knows? But it does show the love and attention to detail that artist made, and that's the really important thing. So we talked, caveats aside, about excessive world building. Oh, and I was going to move on, but Elisa, you are raising your hand, and I mean, come on. So what were you going to say?
Yes, I was just going to add maybe a fourth point that I think in discovering other worlds, we rediscover our own, and I think that's an important aspect of creativity as well. Just thought I'd sneak that in there.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. So I like it because, again, coming up with all the rules of the world, it encourages you to explore what's going on in your own world. How does this fit? I think Chesterton would talk about wow, the world is really crazy when you look at it with new eyes, and that sort of does encourage you. So excellent point. And just for the record, Elisa, you don't have. Thank you for raising your hand. You don't have to next time. You can just cut me right off. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
So. We just talked about the benefits of world building done well, with the caveat of excessive world building that a lot of us are prone to. But now let's look at the other side. And I'm sure we've all read a story, seen a movie where there's world building, but it's done poorly. If someone tries to world building and does it poorly, Elisa, how would you say that can detract from a story?
Yeah, I think to me, bad world building is probably either just really derivative, because I think you can choose not to world build, and that's okay and valid. I mean, sometimes your story will need some setting, so I'm not saying skip over the parts that the story needs, but it's also okay to tell a story and not get into it. But when you do attempt world building, I think it's very, sometimes you enter stories where, you feel like you've been there before, except this is, the dollar menu version that's going to give you a stomachache afterwards, that kind of derivative. But I also think sometimes world building can be so bad that those worlds actually drive you away from a story. I really hate to pick on anybody. I'm going to, I guess. I think for me, the Maze Runner series is like that, where that world to me is so much one I don't want to inhabit that I just don't have any interest in reading those stories. I apologize, to the author, but to me, it is a violent, brutal, traumatizing world that inherently that exists. And so it's just not one that I want to be a part of. And so I think maybe at its worst, having a certain kind of world, you might find your readers just never want to go there. But I also think, just like any creative act, something that's sort of not done thoroughly, or, when you're not like giving your stories a life of their own, but they're very like, what is the word? They're kind of like manipulative. I think that can also exist in world building. Yeah.
It makes me think of like, because you.
Oh, go ahead, Evangeline.
You mentioned the Maze Runner, and so I was thinking of the like dystopian craze, kind of around early 2000s, and it just made me think of, that same feeling. And it's fine to have, to write in a genre, but you can do that while creating a world, and bringing something fresh to it. And I think it's staleness, that we're kind of like identifying when we're saying, okay, this world building is lacking something. It's just like, I've been here before. Show me to what's new, what's interesting. And if it's not there, then it just kind of falls short.
Yeah. And we might as well linger on the Maze Runner here, since we're all piling on now. But I will just say just get my priors out there. I'm not a big dystopian fan. Like, if you like it, fine. It's just not my cup of tea generally. So I wasn't like a big Hunger Games fan, just because, because of my priors. So when I saw stuff like the Divergent series and Maze Runner, it was like, oh, it's like Hunger Games, only worse probably. And, I don't know that. And both those book series are hugely successful, so who am I to talk? But it does show the danger of doing that, because whether they meant to or not, maybe the authors didn't mean to do this at all. There's always the impressions like, oh, you're hopping on this thing, and you're sort of trying to coast off of what they're doing. So the Maze Runner world, presumably, again, I'm speaking out of ignorance here, is kind of like the Hunger Games world, only slightly worse. There's the evil bad guy, corporation, government, whatever, the heroic little guy, and whatever. There's a lack of originality there that seems easy to get cynical about. Am I way off there? Am I generally on the right track there, Elisa?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry. I love how I phrased it. Am I way off there? And you're like, way off, extremely off. I don't know. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I do find something I do find kind of interesting about dystopian stories is that they're very reflective of postmodern worldviews or postmodern thinking, which I find I focused a lot on philosophy in my undergrad. So any chance to sneak some philosophy talk in there, I'll take. But yeah, I do think they can be interesting from that perspective, kind of almost as an intellectual exercise in some ways. But yeah, I do think that when you to me, I think why I don't like the Maze Runner world is partly because of how violent it is. And I'm not saying that I'm trying to think now. I feel like I have to caveat that I'm not saying any violence in a story is bad. So I certainly have stories I enjoy that have violence, but I think there's a nihilistic perspective behind that. We're trapped in a world that we can't ever escape out of. And it's just kind of it feels like it's brutal for no reason. It doesn't really serve a purpose in the story. It's almost more like the story is serving the purpose of being brutal in that world. At least that's just kind of my impression. But yeah, I agree that when I kind of want to caveat, if people are trying to create, I think sometimes we get paralyzed by never wanting to repeat anything that anybody else has ever made before. And I don't want to discourage people from just get out there and be creative and don't necessarily worry about if you're doing something that somebody else has done, or if you're in a medieval fantasy inspired world, that's okay. Yes, you will find many stories that exist in that kind of space, but that's fine. I think it's more like repeating something in a way that's clearly lazy. That's kind of more maybe what I would try to say is it's not you can have the same idea and have it, told in new and fresh ways because it's coming from your perspective and there's thought behind it. And that's great. I don't want to discourage that. It's more when it's just kind of insert standard random cliche detail here without making it your own or delving into the questions of why or trying to see that actually play out in a story. I think that's more where I feel like it gets that feeling of being derivative for me.
Yeah, and this is a quotation I think is real, might be apocryphal, but there's this quotation like, everything that could be written has been written, everything to be said has been said. And that was written by an Egyptian poet in like 4000 BC. So there's always been this thought like, everything's derivative, right? I mean, in a sense, yes, everything is derivative. Like, again, story I'm writing, I've heard people describe it quite fairly as Harry Potter meets Jurassic Park. It's like, yeah, there are elements there. I'm trying my best to make it my own and to try to put my own stamp on it. But yeah, you can see how it derives from both of those sources. And I'm sure, like Elisa, you can point that to those. You can point to source for yours. You can do that too, Evangeline. But it almost seems like, beyond the derivative thing, the danger of world building is, if you're gonna do it, you better do a good job. And as you hinted at, Elisa, it's possible to tell a good story with very little world building. Like I saw a YouTube video talking about Spirited Away as an example of kind of soft world building, where it's sort of like a few impressions here and there, but they didn't bother to fill out all the specifics because they didn't need to, and the story still works really well. So that's a decision. But if you're going to do it, you need to actually put in the work. You can't just sort of, see generally Star Wars or see generally Hunger Games. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Evangeline, either in terms of the battle against making your world derivative, or if you're going to do some world building, gosh darn it, you better do a good job?
That's a good, yeah, for sure. Because somebody will come along and let you know where the holes are when you thought that you thought of everything. I know people are always pointing out, in the magical world, why are Harry Potter's glasses always broken, or whatever. Those little things like, why is this? Why is that? And people are always going to do that. So, but at the same time, don't let that freeze you up. Completely stop you from moving forward, because yes, there's always going to be a problem. There's always going to be something, but, like Elisa's talking about, that's where, maybe broad strokes are going to be your friend. Because you can leave, stuff to the imagination. You can hint at things. And, I've kind of discovered that's where I'm most comfortable, is like kind of at the intersection of real, meets the extraordinary. And so then you can just bring in the bits that you want, but you're still working in a real world. Mm-hmm. But that's for me. I mean, I'm comfortable there, and I'm not prone to excessive world building. But it's like one or the other, because I know that there are people who eat up like Brandon Sanderson and his world building, and that's fantastic. Yeah. I think what's hard is when you get a reader who, loves Brandon Sanderson, and they come to a story where there is not that level of detail, and they're frustrated. And so it's always like this, walking this tightrope of playing to your strengths, but then also considering what a reader is going to want.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the tightrope of reader expectations. I mean, it's so easy to go either way, right? It's very easy to imagine, someone like, say me, adding in too much world building detail, and then an average reader's gonna be like, why the frick are you discussing, the monetary system in your city? Get to the story, dude. Or it's also easy to think of a reader who, like you said, Evangeline, comes from the Brandon Sanderson school, and they're like, well, I need to know more about this world. It seems like you just sort of yada, 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 all the good stuff. What's going on? Elisa, I'm guessing you have experience on this tightrope. What are your tips for navigating it without falling off either to the darn it! I was going to do an allusion to the Odyssey. What are those things that Odysseus needs to navigate between, the Charybdis and the Scylla and Charybdis? How do you navigate between those two? I almost said between them two. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and I'm probably the wrong person to ask, I just give them a good shove, and like it or not, here we are. No, but I heard the advice one time. I think this is good advice, especially for people who maybe don't enjoy world building as much is that, like, you as an author know way more than any given character. So as an author, it's important to think of, like, what does your character know about this world? You know, does your character know about the neighboring countries' like history? Do they know about all of the diplomatic relations? You know, do they know about the tapestries that castle has on the wall? Probably not. You know, so what does your character know about the world, and how do they feel about it? And building and tailoring what you do in your world around that, and knowing that every character is probably going to have different perspectives about different things too. And so I think thinking through it that way can be helpful, especially if you're trying to narrow it down. And ultimately, I think when you do write, like, you want to be thinking about the characters' knowledge of that world as well as what you know. And I think sometimes it can be hard to filter yourself out of that, especially if you're a deep, you know, dive person. But I also think there's fun ways to let, like, if you are more in a deep dive, there's fun ways to let that show through. Like, obviously Tolkien is a great example of that. Like, you know, everywhere the characters go, there's like a statue that's an ode to some great myth, you know, or like, there's all this lore that just kind of seeps through. So I think there's ways to integrate it, but I also think probably a good way to narrow that line is to be thinking about the characters who are inhabiting that world.
I think that's really good advice. I like that.
And then maybe
I really like that too, and it helps you take the perspective of the character, which if you're doing your job as an author, you should be doing anyway. And as it turns out, that's a good way to tell the important world building stuff without getting either too indulgent or too slapdash with it. So now let's get a little bit into the how-tos. So let's go back to our hypothetical young author. And he's like, okay, you've convinced me that world building is important. I have sort of the basis of my story. I have the basis of my characters. I want to build a world. How do I do it? Elisa, please tell me how to build a world.
Well, I feel like everybody's going to have their own method. But that said, if it's like, if there's not a lot of like natural inspiration, there's a lot of resources out there, including like Evangeline, I think you mentioned this earlier, but like books, workbooks and stuff. So there's a few of those that exist out there now where you can like get, basically it's like a journal with prompts and it will like, you know, ask you questions about like, you know, history and language and probably money and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of good books out there too. I think one of the most famous that I'm aware of is Randy Ellefson. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he's written a series on world building, everything from like culture and religion to like how science things work, you know. So if you are trying to create a world, what you might want to know in terms of like, you know, water tends to go from the mountains to the sea and like flows in that direction and that kind of thing. But I think if you're like not necessarily looking for that kind of systematic, like I think it's fun to let your natural curiosity kind of guide you. So like for me, it's, you know, reading books on science in our world, reading books on history in our world, reading books about other cultures. And like for me, a lot of what drives my world building is just learning about things and then getting inspired by them, you know, or reflecting on them. I think that's a good way. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to add?
I feel like Evangeline does, because we have had conversations with her about her needing to come up with some like sciencey things. So she was like asking her husband Corey to like, okay, make this sciencey magic thing just sciencey enough to be plausible. So I feel like you have the battle scars from that, Evangeline.
I do. I was going to agree with Elise on the curiosity and letting that lead. That's always been kind of how I end up pursuing a world or, you know, creating a world. That's how I ended up, you know, creating a world inside a curio cabinet for my book Curio, which, you know, then of course spun into creating, you know, who would live in that world. Well, it would be, you know, these porcelain creatures and these, you know, wind up creatures sort of, and well, what is their society like? And, what are their problems and how do they run? And all of that. And all of that just started with curiosity and, falling in love with the word curio, which is weird. And then, kind of spinning out from there. So yeah, I think that that's a great way to kind of to get into it, especially when you're someone like me who's a little more hesitant. Because if you're curious, then there's joy there, and so you're going to want to pursue that and kind of flesh that out rather than it feeling like just like unnecessary work that's like bogging you down. And then yeah, when I came to stuff that I couldn't I couldn't explain, I did like go to other sources and be like, yeah, give me this. I mean, my husband got me through my science classes in college, so so he's really good at like, distilling it down to the main idea that I need. And that's what you do, is you just like find an expert or find somebody who can, help you understand that part and, and make it work, and then move on. And, don't get bogged down with those aspects that kind of don't come naturally.
Yep. Yeah, and I think part of it is just along the lines of what both you were saying, just like letting your inner nerd just run wild, just like set them loose, let them frolic, because that'll just make your world building so much easier. Because, well, for one thing, it's not going to feel like work when you're doing the research. Like my world, and again, readers, listeners, I'm sorry, you're probably thinking shut up about the book, but anyway, for my work is it takes place in a period of time that I happen to just have this nerdy fascination with, or like the classical world. So I would read books about that stuff just for fun because I'm a nerd and I enjoy it. And setting it there just makes it all the much better. And it, so same thing. It sounds like same thing with you, Evangeline. Same thing with you, Elise. It's like these are things that fascinate me, so I'll just study them. And doing that, we come up with the story. So maybe that'd be a good bit of starting advice to this hypothetical author. It's figure out something that you're super into, like you have this nerdy kind of irrational interest in, and build the world around that, because it's probably going to make it more individual to you, and you're going to actually want to research, which means it's going to be a lot more fun and more authentic.
Any other resources frolic.
Yeah,
I just said let your nerd frolic. Yeah.
We just need just a world full of frolicking nerds.
Right. Well, they need outside anyway.
Exactly. The sunlight will be good for them, the fresh air, and it'll just be good. So we're running a little low on time, and I want to get to our last section here, and that's just examples of world building done well, and then some examples of world building done not so well. So do we all want to we could just talk about Lord of the Rings for world building done well, or do people have other examples? Like Evangeline, Elisa, do you have a non-Lord of the Rings example?
I would argue for
Evangeline, go ahead.
Yeah, Shadow and Bone, Lee Bardugo's series.
Yeah,
fantastic, and I'm excited because the second season is coming out on Netflix in March. But the books, absolutely fantastic, beautiful world building, both in Shadow and Bone. Series. What is that? I can't remember, the Grisha universe, I think, and then also in the duology. Crows that she has, and Six of Crows and something crooked. I can't remember now. Anyway, amazing world building.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I've seen those. I haven't read or seen the show yet, so that's a good recommendation. Thank you. How about you, Elisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think besides Tolkien and Lewis, I think J.K. Rowling, obviously, Brandon Sanderson. I actually think Anne McCaffrey does a really good job. And then I know you guys just talked about this, but Piranesi, to me, that was such a captivating world. Yeah, that one I thought was really good too. And I think like Madeleine L'Engle, to a certain degree, like when she does touch on world building, I think she's very vivid. Like to me, Wrinkle in Time, the planet that she describes in that, I still have like these vivid images from that, even though she's not like very comprehensive, like that sticks with you.
Yep, I will I will second those. And I like how I did this sort of weaselly thing. So I'll talk about Tolkien now that I've made it a forbidden topic. But the thing about Tolkien, it's the quintessential iceberg method, right? Where, like you mentioned, Elisa, like they'll walk past this random meadow and there's a statue there, and you come to learn later, oh, this statue is from the kingdom of blah, 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 which lived in this blah, blah, blah. And that's just, again, I think all modern world building probably derives from Tolkien. So it's not a surprise that he's done well. And again, listeners, I'm sorry, this is on the list of Matt, friggin' shut up. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Susanna Clarke does such a great job. I love her footnotes. It's obvious she built whole lore and world around it. The world just makes sense. I wish I could just sort of marinate in it all the time. It's just a wonderful example of world building done well. So now that I sort of cheated and stole Tolkien for world building done well, I'll take one for the team and start in the lead off for world building done poorly. Let me start with a movie that I felt was not very good. Then I'm going to go to a TV series that I thought was good despite the kind of poor world building. The bad one, do you guys remember this movie called Bright that was on Netflix?
Yeah.
So Will Smith's in it. It's like magic and fairies and trolls and elves are real, but they're in like modern day LA. The world building, it wasn't a great movie. I didn't get very far in it. But the world building seemed kind of slapdash. It's like they have the ideas like, hey, what if like fairies and stuff lived in LA, which sounds really cool. And that sort of concept has been done well. Like look at the Dresden Files, who does a good job with a similar concept. But they just sort of slapped them together. It's like, all right, we got Will Smith, let's go. You could tell it wasn't thought out. They hadn't really thought of like, oh, what's ogre culture or what's elf culture? It all seemed, again, like you were saying, Elisa, kind of slapdash, kind of derivative. So that was an example one done poorly. One done poorly in a show that I liked is the show Wednesday on Netflix. I really enjoyed that show. Definitely recommend it. But my one gripe, they did a lot of good world building. So Wednesday's at this sort of school. Again, Harry Potter at blah, blah, blah. It's this school called Nevermore, was sort of a school for like creepy students. So Wednesday's there, obviously. But then they tried to introduce all these different like races of magical creatures there. So there's sirens, there's vampires, there's werewolves, which is all fine. And it could be done well. But I felt like they didn't think it all the way through. Like they just got enough to get the story going, didn't give any depth. Like they mentioned that the school has lots of vampires. Where are they? Where do they get their blood? What the heck is going on? Or they like Wednesday's friend is a werewolf. They don't go into a whole lot of specifics there. It just felt like they hinted at stuff without actually digging into it. But with that said, still really enjoyed the show. Evangeline, you were nodding your head to the Wednesday talk. Do you want to throw some thoughts in there?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I enjoyed it. And yeah, you're like, oh, okay, well, what's going to come in with these sirens, which were particularly interesting. And then there's a kid who's like a Medusa kid. Yeah, so you're like, more, please. And then, but maybe, I think there's another season. Maybe we'll get more of it. But yeah, I totally agree. I started watching, there's a new werewolf series, has Sarah Michelle Gellar, and of course I'm like Buffy fan, so I'm like, okay, Buffy is back, and so I'm looking for something different in this werewolf story, and there is nothing yet. And I was kind of like interested at first. Because it starts out with this forest fire, and I'm like, okay, that's so cool because we're that's so knowable or so relevant. We're got this, so and maybe they're going to build on that. I don't know, but I was like, what does this have to do with the werewolves other than it kind of fleshing things out? Yeah, so I don't know. I'm hanging on. I'm hoping there's going to be a little bit more there, but so far I'm like, come on, Buffy.
Yeah,
Who isn't really
I feel like
Buffy?
they've got a
She's
great
not
start, right?
Buffy.
It's like, yeah, it's like we've got werewolves, yeah, and Sarah Michelle Gellar, yeah, and what else? That's it.
Yep. I know. Yep. We'll
All
see
right,
where it goes.
Elisa, what are some... Great. So, Elisa, what are some examples for you of world building done poorly? And by the way, let me say, listeners, we're doing this on Zoom so I can see Elisa's face. This is so much to your credit. I can tell you really don't want to criticize other pieces of art, and I kind of wish I had more of your scruples with that on this podcast. But anyway, go right ahead.
I feel like I'm gonna get some flack for this, but like Terry Brooks and Robert Jordan, to me, I don't find them terrible. I just don't feel like, I think they're good writers, but I don't feel the world building is especially compelling. I feel like the Aragon series, I know it has some like hardcore fans, but I had a hard time with the world building in that one. Granted, impressive for a young person, and probably, yes. I mean, it's easier to be a critic, so probably very well done. But I just struggled with, like, I remember even just looking at the map in Aragon and kind of like feeling like I was just like wondering like what's up with all the languages in this and like the way the words were formed. I had questions. But yeah.
All right. And once again, like I mentioned with Wednesday, you can have a really good show of work with these flaws, right? So pointing out these things doesn't mean that the whole work is bad, but it is definitely one aspect of it because, Wednesday's show I really enjoyed, that was kind of a road bump there. It's like, what's like Evangelist says, like, what's going on with the sirens? I feel like we need to explain this. So it's just something to be cautious of. So we are now running out of time. So Elisa, where can we find you? Where can we find your writing? Where can we find out about your world?
Deep in a hole, and I'll probably emerge at some point. I'm not very findable these days, mostly because I'm one of those very picky people that wants to make everything perfect, which I know that's a flaw. But so at the moment you can't, but maybe someday you'll be able to. I don't know.
Well, we're going to be starting up our Arts Guild meetings here soon, so there's going to be some demand for some more of the world you've built. Oh, and Evangeline, closing thought for you.
Yes, I submit, at least for us, for the guild, instead of Anselmians or Anselmites, we could be just the Guilders.
Oh, I
Guilders.
like that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Guilders?
Oh, yeah, Gilder. Okay. I feel like that's like an imaginary country in something.
Gilderland.
It's in Princess Bride, right?
Oh,
yeah, Princess Bride, Gilder.
I was thinking Knight's Tale when they were talking about Gelderland. And we already have the theme.
Oh, he's from Gelderland. Yes.
Yeah, but this is Gilder, Guilder, the Guilders.
Well, I'm down with both the Princess Bride and the Knight's Tale reference, so that works for me. A Gilder.
Great
All
mashup.
Right. There we go. All right. Well, Evangeline and Elisa, thank you both so much for joining us. This was super fun. And as the rest of y'all can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. You have, say 20 to 30 seconds to spare right now. Why not rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast? All of us Guilders would thank you. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.